Let's continue our discussion of national identity, and particularly national identity as it relates to Canada in the Canadian context. And let's consider again our discussion of how a vision of what Canada was and is, and what its identity is and should be, has evolved over time, and it has been inclusive of a number of different visions. We consider again, as we had just spoken about, the idea of and the challenges that Francophones see within a new view or vision of Canada, particularly as its population has shrunk in relation to the English population, expanding into different parts of what would become Canada, making it all the way to the Pacific, and how the Quebec population, even as it has grown within Quebec, has shrank in relation to the overall population, and therefore its power and influence has declined. We talked about the fact that basically the Francophones within this new reality saw three options. One was to accept their new position in Canada, or two, promote a vision of Quebec as a strong but autonomous province within Canada, or a third view or option was the vision of a strong, separate, or sovereign Quebec. And we also talked about the idea of Canadian nationalism and how over time, with historical events such as the conscription crisis of World War I and World War II, that in fact the ideas of nationalism, of a strong and separate Quebec, have evolved. We talked about the fact that in '76 and in 1994 there were referendums where the population, the voting populations of Quebec at the time, actually voted on whether or not to separate from Canada. We talked about the fact that in 1976 that it was 60% in favor of remaining in Canada and 40% favoring leaving Canada, whereas in 1994 it was much closer. It was less than 1% difference between the two sides. And so let's continue from there. Let's consider the idea of immigration and the impact immigration has had on Canada, on its identity, and on the evolution of a vision of Canada. Well, prior to the 1960s, and prior to World War II, particularly in the 1890s, there was an effort by the federal government to settle Western Canada, and so many people were encouraged to come to Canada, particularly from Eastern Europe. We see a number of Ukrainian immigrants arriving in Western Canada. But after World War II, the nature of immigration changed dramatically. Particularly in the 1960s, we see immigrants arriving from different parts of the world. As opposed to Eastern Europe, many immigrants now come from, or have come from, Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, so on and so forth. Asia, of course, many people coming from India, Pakistan to a certain extent, and various parts of Asia, including Hong Kong and other parts of what would become China. As well, people coming from the Caribbean, many people coming from Jamaica, Trinidad, and other parts of the British West Indies, and of course immigrants coming from Africa. So the nature of the immigrants changed quite clearly after the 1960s, and this had a significant impact on the identity and vision of Canada. These new immigrants experienced levels of discrimination that prior groups who came from Northern Europe or the United States, or even to a lesser extent Eastern Europe, experienced. These immigrants faced much greater levels of racism and discrimination. Let's consider now the idea of Canada within the founding peoples, the original founding peoples, those of the Aboriginal Canadians. And we see over time that Aboriginal Canadians had a concerted effort to assert their rights as Canadians. Well, of course, if we talk about the English-Canadian treatment of Métis and the fact that there were two rebellions in 1870 and 1885 in regards to the Métis, who happened to be of mixed First Nations and European ancestry, and that for the most part the Métis were French speakers, we see that this has had an impact on the identity of Canada and as well as on the vision that people have or have had in relation to Canada. As I mentioned, in 1870, there was a Red River Rebellion where the Métis population that had lived there for some time were basically forced out by English-speaking settlers, and eventually the province of Manitoba, following the Red River Rebellion, is created and becomes part of the Dominion of Canada. The Northwest or Métis Rebellion of 1885 in the areas of Batoche and Saskatchewan had significant impact on history within Canada, on the development of the country, and certainly on its identity and the vision that people held of Canada at the time. In fact, today the Constitution entrenches rights both of Métis and Aboriginal people within Canada, and that has to a large extent resulted from the efforts that Aboriginal Canadians have made in asserting their own rights. Let's consider the Indian Act and the idea of self-determination. In 1876, the Indian Act was passed, and this gave the federal government total control over the native peoples. And basically, the First Nations, Métis, the Inuit, fell under complete domination of the federal government. And in fact, instead of recognizing these groups as founding peoples of Canada, there was a concerted and direct attempt to assimilate these cultures into Canada and to eradicate these cultures altogether. Over time, the Indian Act has been amended many times, but the impact of the Act on the Aboriginal peoples of Canada has been, to say the least, a dramatic impact. Today, and largely as a result of Aboriginal peoples asserting their rights and struggling to achieve these rights, today there are collective rights that Aboriginal peoples, particularly First Nations, Métis, have that are entrenched within the Constitution. And this is part of the evolving vision of Canada, and it has had a large impact in the development and evolution of the identity, the national identity of Canada. Well, let's look at Canada today. We consider the challenges of the French, the Francophones within Canada historically, and the attempts of Aboriginal people to assert their rights and the struggles that they faced in their efforts to do so. Let's now consider Canada today in regards to those ideas. Well, let's start with the founding nations debate. Originally, the English and French saw themselves and were viewed as the founding peoples of Canada. Remember that the Dominion of Canada becomes something that occurs on the basis of Lower and Upper Canada coming together, a bicultural initiative to achieve responsible government. And so the founding nations idea is that the English and French were the original founding peoples of Canada. Today we see somewhat of a different picture. Today we see three founding peoples. We see the English and the French, but also the Aboriginal peoples, that all three groups were and are seen as the founding people of the country. But with the policy of multiculturalism, the whole idea of a culture mosaic, in fact the concept of a vertical mosaic, that when we look at disparity economically, that we see English speakers at the top, immigrants further down the line, and the Aboriginal peoples at the lower end, the idea of a vertical concept, of a vertical mosaic comes forward. But what about the ideas of immigrants, the contributions of immigrant peoples within Canada, and how are they recognized? And so this falls within that whole idea of the founding nations debate. And it also leads to, and another debate arises, that of the multiculturalism debate. And let's consider that for a moment. Currently, there's a debate over whether or not the federal policy of multiculturalism, encouraging and recognizing ethnic diversity and seeing tolerance as a basis, an important basis for Canada's identity, and that the actual identity, the national identity of Canada is an actual mosaic in which the various tiles, the multicolored tiles, are actually the various ethnic groups within Canada. There are many people that wonder if that's actually wise, and that perhaps instead of strengthening the idea of Canada, that a vision of Canada is actually weakened. Well, it's hard to say exactly which vision is correct, but what we do understand that there is a evolving vision, and it's based on various visions coming together, in which Canada is at one time seen as a bicultural country that had time to emerge and evolve into a vision in which there were three founding peoples, and that eventually, with the inclusion and the recognition of the contributions of immigrants within Canada, that what we see today is basically a civic nation, a country that recognizes certain basic principles, but that is made up of various ethnic groups. In fact, as Joe Clark had mentioned, a community of communities, or as others have stated, a nation made up of nations. As you can see, the vision of Canada is quite dynamic.